Thanks for coming by, everybody. We're so excited to have Winnie Song here with us. Winnie Song, the developer of Bad Blood, which I hope you've had a chance to play. We've had it set up now for about a week in our lounge. And if you hadn't, it's still going to be out for another week, so please grab a friend, wear a mask, and murder each other. So we're so excited to have Winnie here with us today at the Micah Game Lab. Winnie Song is a Korean-Canadian game maker living in New York City. Her works include Boss, Drunk Walk, and my personal favorite, Bad Blood, which is a ruthless two-player game of hide-and-seek with deadly consequences. I was mentioning to Winnie, this is kind of an interesting arc for me personally. One of the first local multiplayer game nights that we ran as a program here featured Bad Blood, and it was a really big thing. I was so excited because it really demonstrated a lot of kind of the interesting, artistic, and kind of engaging gameplay that we really wanted to put in front of our students as a kind of inspiration. So this is a real treat for me to be able to reconnect here and invite Winnie to come talk to us tonight. If you haven't played Bad Blood, it's a delightful, disorienting game. It taps into these joys of dangerous childhood play, which seem to really be captivating our collective imagination these days. Winnie has a BFA in graphic design from Ontario College of Art Design University and an MFA in game design from NYU Game Center, where she currently teaches game design and visual design. She's previously worked as a game designer at Square Enix Montreal and currently makes games independently. And on her website, she says that she's striving for a rich visual life in the world of her games. Let's all welcome Winnie Song tonight.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. And it means so much to me that the fact that you did play those games and also that it led to you inviting me to give this talk. And I'm really thrilled and honored. So let's get into it. I'm going to share my presentation. So again, thanks for having me. I'm Winnie Song, and thanks to Sam for giving a really great in-depth introduction, so I don't have to do it. But just to reiterate a little bit, I am faculty at Game Center, NYU Game Center, at which I also did my MFA. I'm teaching game design and visual design. I think coming from that visual design background, as I mentioned, I think that has been kind of my main handle and language with which I tend to make games because it is my strong suit. So I think that kind of point of view will be kind of sprinkled throughout this, mainly design talk / career talk a little bit, which is how I'm gonna, I think, run this. But I am going to mainly talk about that game. And as I mentioned, it's also out there if you want to go play it. It was also my first ever commercially released video game. And a solo game and also a thesis game. So there was a student project here at Game Center. And I think that experience really informed and led to the kind of game developer I am today. And it's informing all the games that I've made since and will continue to make. And I think that could be an interesting perspective for especially, I think, students of game design. So I'll try to kind of cater the talk around that. Slight disclaimer about the depiction of violence in this talk. They're not always explicit. They will be excessive, and I might have a lot of slides that have some depiction of violence. So if you feel queasy around that stuff, feel free to look away and just listen or something. To begin with, I'm going to show a launch trailer for Bad Blood when it released, I believe in 2015, right? November 13th or something like that. I just remember that was the Friday the 13th because I made sure to release it on that day just to have a little fun with it. But I still, that time in my life is very fuzzy, but I think it's 2015, but let's see. Yeah, so as kind of Sam prefaced earlier, this is a game that is sort of a combination of like two of my interests at the time, and the kind of thing that like really informed all of the aesthetics um, that I was interested in, which was this kind of like early, nostalgic kind of playground sense of play of like tag and hide and seek and things like that, um, married with the aesthetic of violence, right? Which was the kind of prevalent mechanic in all of the games that I played pretty consistently all my life. And I would wonder if there's anyone in the audience tonight who's like never played a violent game in their lives in some form in which you enact violence or others, either NPCs or other players, can enact violence upon you. But also having come from a sort of visual design background, I was most interested in the role of art direction and kind of leveraging aesthetics to convey philosophy. So I think that really informed the look and feel of this game. And I think the kind of main philosophy is that I was trying to get across, right? So we're just like again, a deadly game of hide and seek. It's a local split screen one-on-one brawler, so it's only one versus one. And it's like a suspenseful kind of slow game that's like, punctuated with frantic violence, where each player sees the arena from like different orientations, but it's the same arena, so we're kind of in the same space. It's very claustrophobic. And you basically have to use stealth, environment manipulation, any kind of like risk reward balancing or something to find and kill your opponent before they find you. And I ended up with this kind of, sort of a grid-based fighting game, right? It's real time, but it's still kind of discrete in movement. And I wanted to make sure that even if you're not really good at like Twitch action games or fighting games, like remembering movesets and things like that, you could get one over someone who is good at those kinds of games, right? Because I was also not great at those games. I wanted to create a system in which I could beat, just using my, smarts and desire to survive, I could beat another person. But generally, I think threat of this kind in video games as a mechanic have always been thrilling to me. And that kind of split-second moment, let's see if this plays okay, great. When you kind of realize your mistake, there's something existing about kind of, being in a kind of very intimate one-to-one relationship with the person that you're trying to kill, right? I think it requires a lot of emotional investment. And I think to enact violence upon someone, you require passion by nature, right? And I think the kind of effect that I got out of the audience of this game and players of this game was reflecting on that, right? They came out of it feeling like they knew this person better. So I think it's important to always think about where ideas for games come from. And I think because this is a talk at an academic institution, I think it's also important to spotlight work made in institutions like this, which is where Bad Bull is made, where you are, as a student, free and safe to explore ideas, but also make, bad, sometimes inside the box games without judgment, right? And with just the act of catharsis. I think there's like, when you go to a school for game making, you've always thought about making games or like cloning them and remixing the ones that we love. But once you start making them, it's a very different animal, right? So I think it's really important to think about the formulation of the DNA of any kind of game maker starting at this point in which you realize that you want to make games and then you realize you can. Reiteration of my academic history, like Sam mentioned, OKEDU, where you learn graphic design and animation, and game design MFA at NYU Game Center. And then I graduated and became a full-time game developer. But I wanted to talk about some of the games that I made as a student, because I think, again, it was an act of exercising that initial kind of DNA, the interest you have and you bring into games before you even start thinking about making games. And I do think it's kind of a disservice to call these ideas when you're making games at this point. I think ideas are cheap. I think what we're actually making things based on is our instincts, which is sort of biological. They're not like opinions. They're a sort of core drive in what we make. So this is kind of the first game that I ever made when I got to Game Center. It was called Repair. the first of the kind of tile-based game, right? Which is the thing that that kind of is where Bad Blood is based on as a system. This is made with a fellow alum and now also professor at Game Center, Misha Favrov. This is a game called First Impressions. It's a kind of a physics-y game in which you are trying to chew food and also answer questions from your significant others, like a family. And they were like really difficult questions about like your job and your religion or whatever. And basically, if the food in your mouth is too big when you speak, you choke and you can't answer. So it was like that kind of like interesting balancing of those two things. There's another game in the kind of second semester of that school where I made a game called Whistleblower. It's a point-and-click narrative adventure game that all set on like a screen, kind of like Her Story or something like that. But it's where you play as an employee at a kind of space travel company. Basically, you learn because the planet that we're living on Earth has like a unsustainable issue and in terms of climate crisis, and they were trying to get people out of the planet, but they started to stop sending everyone. It's only people who can afford it and things like that. And you basically are acting as a whistleblower, being like, I gotta let people know that they're gonna stop building these spaceships. This is another one. It was a sort of a big, for the first kind of big projects that I worked on with fellow students, Vanessa Briceño and Zach Song. It was inspired by my dog at the time, who was going blind of old age. And it was about, you had to kind of make a sound and this creature, this big robotic creature would come racing towards you, hearing that sound, which is how I had to communicate with my dog at the time. But it was like, it's like understanding the threat and kind of manipulating it and using it for your advantage. And you're kind of acting as the sort of matador or something, where you're inviting violence, and it basically changes the level design so you can get out. And it was an interesting kind of design experiment, thinking about sound and also, where sound happens, essentially in reference to positional information and things like that, and how that informs creature behavior. Drunk Walk, as Sam mentioned earlier. So this is actually not a game that I made at Game Center as a student, but it was a game that I made in an incubator during the summer. But it was like a PS Move controller attached to the player body. And basically you had to kind of move through your apartment and get to the bed without falling over. And it was another kind of physics-y game where I introduced this kind of like drunk force that was random, and it would push your model, and you had to basically adjust. And we're getting kind of closer now in DNA. This is a game called Bloodsport that I also fixed up and released as a kind of like a PT, like playable teaser for Bad Blood at the time. It's called Bloodsport. And it was basically, you were just in the woods with a compass, and you had this creature who was kind of, could kill you. And basically it strikes a deal with you, being like, hey, I'm going to tell you where I'm going to strike from. If you look at me in time, I'm not going to attack you. And you're just like, it's a kind of a score attack game where you keep going. He just gets faster, and he sometimes lies to you if he blinks. And that was also thinking about, again, survival and and the very like intimate kind of human violence, and what we're willing to do to trick another player or another kind of being to survive. But to go back in time, actually, Bad Blood stemmed from a really, really early project as a student. This was like the first time I was learning programming, which is something that was new to me when I came as a student. There's like a made in processing, which is a JavaScript like program. It was made in my first year, and it was also called Bad Blood at the time. But this was a very simple, because again, I was not that proficient at coding, and it was a very simple system where it's just two players as it was, but it was like a hot seat game where a player has to move, and then they have to get up, and another person has to come in, and they have to move. And it was a sort of like real time, although it basically turn-based hidden information game. It's all set in this one building. And every time the player moves from one room to the other, the room that they came from either turns off its light or turns on its light, right? So you're kind of creating a trail of movement. And you have to move 5 times, but you can retrace your steps so you can kind of minimize the changes you make. Basically, you're also doing like pattern memory as a player to be like, okay, I remember those lights being on, which means that they're somewhere around there. And the goal is that on your turn, you want to be in the room, or you want to get to the room in which the opponent is in. I think based on this, and also everything that I worked on before my kind of thesis year, really informed my thesis project, right? And I wanted to kind of solve the problem of a local multiplayer game, which was like a hot thing at the time. I think it was just, really desirable to play and release local multiplayer games. Now it's, I think, colored with a lot of things, external factors that's preventing us from doing so. But I was like, well, I wanted to also solve the kind of grand question of like, how can we make a local multiplayer game with a stealth mechanic, like hidden information, without requiring like this hot seat thing? And I think at the time there were a lot of games coming out. I remember like Shambhala and like Screen Cheat, something like that, something vaguely alike like that, where it was about, again, like information being obfuscated in some way. But even before those games came out, I was thinking about this, and I think I really wanted it to be real time as well, not kind of turn-based. So I did a bunch of prototyping and thinking about also map sizes and map manipulation, and also about like end game. I was already kind of thinking about like, how could I shrink the map over time? Like maybe the grass burns and therefore you can't get to it. But then I was also interested in kind of the theming, this idea of maybe like an apocalyptic future in which kind of nature has taken over. So, and we have to kind of, devolve or go back to a simpler time in which to survive was to kill and like hunt for a living. And what it meant to be also hunting in a post-apocalyptic, so post kind of society and civilization in which violence upon others is frowned upon and illegal, obviously. But then like, how do we readapt into a world in which we have to start doing that to live, right? It's something that was really important, as a student, because I think, again, the world is your oyster at that point because you're so safe and you're like, oh, I can make anything as a student. And, not be afraid of failure because, who cares? I'm a student. But it was important then to kind of create boundaries for myself and put stakes in the ground that is movable, but with effort, right? And that's why it's called stakes in the ground, because it's not permanent, but it takes some work to kind of unearth it and kind of move it around, right? So these are some of the stakes that I had, which was I wanted kind of one hit kill system, not a lot of like health bars that were gonna elongate the game. I wanted to be sort of a slow game, as I've said, which is like not super twitchy and not super like requiring a lot of like instant kind of reaction. Local, for sure. And something to do with like our kind of humanness and their softness, personal and passionate and intimate, and also simple, right? And I think the accessibility point at this point was really important, and learning a bunch of movesets and abilities was not in my interest. And the solution came out pretty simply, right? I think I learned based on prototyping a lot and testing that a little bit of obfuscation of information goes a long way. Not total hiding of information, but just like slight of a cognitive load is confusing enough that the players will need to like really think about it to understand where the player is. So it was just the act of turning one of the cameras around, and it would be randomized every time. So the players will, it could have like a 1 in 4 chance of kind of getting it right the first time. But because it's a one-hit kill game, if you miss the first time, there's a high chance you will get hit back. And then it was, I think, as a prototype, as a kind of thesis project, it was done. And it ended up being this kind of very small scale, almost like a live kind of puzzle game you play with against another person. And the kind of initial desire to make a game where people talked about it after, or talk to each other and get genuinely kind of frustrated or intimately involved with another person was effective. I received kind of great feedback and like a variety of responses from players that really surprised me, right? Being like, well, this is just a silly game where you just play like a little fun game against another person, but I kind of got this like really strong reactions from people. And the game took me to places, that I never imagined that I would go, because I think it had something to say, and I had something to say via it. It took me to like fighting game tournaments, like Evo which took me to Vegas, which is a really interesting location for a fighting game tournament. I always felt Las Vegas is a place where it's like, oh, it's about this kind of like flow state, and you're kind of getting into a zone where you're like, just putting coins in and pulling this lever. Not really about excellence in any way or getting good. And then like in the conference room in Las Vegas, there's all these incredible fighting game players who are at a just a level of excellence and sportsmanship. Anyway, and also like art game conferences, and like at Indicate, and also Day of the Devs and things like that. And then I graduated, and this is my work history in games. I kind of did some adjunct professor work, and also did a bunch of freelancing before I went to Square Enix Montreal. And I also did some contract work. And then I became sort of full-time indie. And now I'm teaching at NYU Game Center. I want to talk a little bit about that kind of transition from like a studio of like a double to AAA size into an independent developing. Not because I think it should inform anyone's career decisions, but I think it's stemming very directly from what I think games should do and what I thought Bad Blood was going to do. And to talk about that, I think it's important to talk about some of the games that inspired me to make games. The first time I realized I could make games was when I played, I think, Papers, Please, which was a solo development by Lucas Pope. And also, I think the thing that really inspired me, or that was really kind of traumatic for me almost, was that it really messed me up. The kind of emotions it was able to pull from me, despite a very simple system of finding mistakes in a bunch of documents, or like inconsistencies and things like that. I think even before that, before I even applied for school, I think maybe the first time I knew I wanted to make games was maybe playing Portal series. And I think there was a moment in the game that I want to share. There's like a little Easter egg in this game where you find a radio playing a song by The National, and it's like very tinny and distorted. I think that also messed me up because, again, I think it was able to kind of transport me into feeling like I have been in solitude. So this is a game where you are sort of a test subject, and you've been like in this kind of facilities as a human being for an incredibly long period of time, not interacting with anyone. And despite this being kind of like early on in the game, when I first heard it, it felt like I hadn't heard music in like 100 years. Or maybe it was like a little bit earlier in middle school when I was playing this game called The Logical Journey of These Minis by Broderbund. So it was a game about playing these logic puzzles so that you can spring these creatures out from slavery and bring them to sort of a utopian city of their building. And there was like a moment in this game where if you don't do well, if you don't solve the puzzle well, which at the time, because I was super young, sometimes I failed the puzzles, there will be like extreme consequences that are not permanent. You can save these creatures again, but there will be these animations of these NPCs like enacting harm or like throwing these creatures away, and like learning that was because of me failing, and like all of that responsibility being on me also messed me up a bit, right? Being like I was indirectly responsible for the violence upon these creatures. And I think I have played countless games throughout these years and since then and afterwards. And I think it was important for me to really realize what of them stood out and why they kind of stayed with me over time, because I played for them for so long. And I think if you play games for so long, they all blur, right? They go like, you kind of don't remember the ones that you've played even for a long time. But the ones that do stick out in your mind are the ones that have caused some kind of change in you, right? Some kind of reaction. I think that's how I got to game making, and also as at a game school, and to really figure out what made me tick, and kind of harness that power. But once I got out into the industry, right, which is something that we're all thinking about as students, it's like, well, be a post school, if I were to go into a studio or maybe like an independent studio, whatever. The context changes, right? It's no longer just enough to talk about games with like-minded people and get excited about them and make games that really move you. You also have to do this thing called make profit, and survive and things like that. And I think survival is important. I think for any artist, any designer, any all aspects, all disciplines that it takes to make games. But I think for me, the kind of survival that I was interested in was like freedom in some way. And I think what a video game company needs to survive is ultimately, you want to kind of keep your job, you want to keep the benefits, you want to get paid a livable wage, get all this healthcare. You want to be comfortable, and you want to, survive in an industry that's so quick and changing. And obviously, there's no shame in that. I think it's just, it's about what sustains us individually. And I think at the time, and I think dissonance is really reaching its critical point these days. This kind of developer / artist relationship with like game studios and what each is willing to kind of give up for each other, right? For that kind of connection to work. Square Enix, despite being like one of the kind of best companies to work with, Square Enix Montreal, Canada in general is a great place to work in games. And the kind of like creative freedom that they allow its developers is really unique. But Square Enix Montreal also has a mother company, which is Square Enix, which is constantly kind of pressuring it to make profit. And I also learned very recently, there was like a news article that came out about Square Enix going all in on like NFTs and stuff. And I know for a fact there are my ex-colleagues there are probably devastated about that idea. But again, it's the industry is changing in that way, and the things that it cares about is always going to change. The thing that can't change, and the thing that you have to really be permanent about, is the things that you care about and the things that sustain you, right? I want to talk about a moment in which I realized this, which was I went to this conference called Casual Connect. So Square Enix Montreal is a mobile company. So this is like a mobile conference. It also had like an indie game showcase, which was like filled with students, and we were sponsoring it and we were judging it. So it was like another interesting kind of stark contrast. And I sat in these kind of design talks looking at these like numbers, and like shaky affirmations on the future of the industry, and like how we can kind of pull numbers from these players in this really kind of cold way. And these are real slides from the talk, from the conference, by the way. This idea of like survivorship bias and, what it takes to kind of make games that's gonna keep itself alive. And it was difficult also to work at a studio and try to convince people that numbers going up isn't proof of anything. And that the only thing that we can really trust is our own gut, right? This kind of gut feeling that we have that a game is gonna work and it's gonna play well, and players are gonna love it. So I think just trying to convey that was such a difficult hurdle, so much so that I think just decided to kind of give up, which I don't think, I think that, again, the threshold is very different for everyone. But again, it was really difficult for me to be like, okay, how do I convince a bunch of my colleagues and also like producers and people in the panels and in talks, CEOs and things like that an idea is going to work without giving them like number proof. I think this kind of gut feeling is what informs me, and also is one of the kind of most important compasses we have as game developers. And I think we should always be thinking about this, because again, the thing that we have to live with at the end of the day is us and our values. And I want to do a short kind of academic kind of theory talk about games for this feeling. I do think there's like games for other kinds of usage. For example, the games that are made for the head or the mind. So these are kind of like, they ask for creative thinking and logic and rationality. They require concentration, some kind of mechanical excellence. The kind of games for the heart, games that kind of present us with a story or a message, tries to move us emotionally. And then there's the kind of question of like, well, what are the kind of games for the gut, right? What should a gut game do? I think the main difference is processing. It's not just thinking or feeling. It's like a form of action, right? And also kind of an outcome that comes out of it. So I have all these kind of like, I think the gut games, and when we play a game, which is consumption, there's a kind of language that comes out of it, which is a way for our body to tell us something we ate and how we feel about that, right? And then to consume is to also have this output and this kind of feeling afterwards, and to kind of have this waste and rot that we have to deal with as players. I think these are the games that really intrigue me and interest me. And I think just learning that truth about myself was really important for making games going in the future. I also kind of gave this talk at Amaze Berlin about violence in games, which I'll talk very briefly about, because I think it's this kind of discourse comes around every year or something, right? Where we talk about, what violence is doing in games and why do we need it, or why can't we get rid of it, and just like have really peaceful feeling games or something. And it kind of stemmed from this question where every time when I was like testing with Bad Blood and bringing it to places, I would have questions asking me like, oh, why does it have to be so violent? Why is there so much blood on here? I think the question is very truistic and very kind of basic, because it's questioning the necessity of violence rather than like what is it actually doing in games, right? So I think this question is stemming from not excess of violence in games, but because the game's employment of violence is not convincing to us in some way. I think when we think about what violence is doing, it's actually like this, where which is quite natural, because I think that's how like media depicts violence in games, where it's like it desensitizes our children from the effects of violence, the results of violence. And I think the gut instinct also, because this disturbs us, seeing a lot of blood, because that's a human blood, that's human viscera. We can kind of empathize with that. It really disturbs us in that way. But the thing about Bad Blood is that it's not really violent. There's not a lot of blood in it. But I was still kind of getting these questions. So I thought about why. And it's because what violence is actually doing in games is this. This is a Rhodes Revenge, which came out in '91. And I played a lot as like a 5-year-old, I guess, at the time. Basically, you play this mouse and you're moving these tiles around to kind of keep these cats away from you. And it was really scary because the cats also moved diagonally through blocks, which is something that you kind of learn as you play. There's no tutorialization telling you that. So learning that was really scary. Something that I think I didn't realize at the time was the fact that you were also capable of violence, and you're also caging these cats in, and they become cheese that you can eat. So in many ways, you're actually have more power, right? That you can, and like capability for violence that you can enact on these cats, which is like Bale's is going to eat you, but you're also caging them and also eating them. And I think consequently, what I realized retroactively about all the violent games that I played is that they're not really about violence. They're like, dart games basically, where they're testing for my precision skills. And they're always trying to like comfort me. They're trying to tell me like what I did was for the good of everyone. You're killing only bad people or whatever. Or, whenever they show off cool violent moments, they kind of create this like smooth bomb over it, being like, oh, by the way, violence is bad. And all these kind of instances of like trying to replace human violence with like non-human violence, right? Typical. And even the games that are like cartoonish or not meant to be violent in any way are just stand-ins for hurting others, right? And kind of quote unquote killing them, eradicating them in some way. And I think when I was making Bad Blood, I watched a lot of like nature shows, so like BBC Earth and things like that, because I think those shows are really good at showing us that balance is necessary for survival, right? And it's also an act of love sometimes, like you're providing for family in these kind of shows, all the animals, I mean. And I watched a lot of movies and read a lot of samurai comics and TV shows like Vikings, where violence is like the foundation of society and also the show's kind of main aesthetic. And also murder just generally has existed in media for as long as media existed. So it's really weird for games to be like suddenly apologetic about it and like, oh, we should get rid of this kind of theming, as if like that hasn't informed every story we've told each other since conception of our society. And I think kind of emboldened by this idea, I wanted to make sure that the visuals of the game was, very human, right? I wanted to kind of create these very human creatures that were saying very specific things about the way we enact violence upon them. I wanted to briefly talk about some of the characters in this game that you can play as and kind of the idea behind them. So the first is Hunter, who is implied to be cannibalistic, and his character was inspired by the kind of Bretian code of like grub first, then ethics. We all gotta eat. I think that's just the fact of existence. And the things that we must give up to make that happen is really dependent on the people and the circumstance and context, right? And we can kind of judge all we like, but we all gotta eat. The second character, which I think was like one of the most kind of what the game kind of became known for, was this character called the Mechanic. She kind of represented familial vengeance, this idea that some violence was enacted upon her family, and she was kind of reacting to it. She was like a sort of a avenger type. The kid was meant to kind of represent the kind of physical adjustments that young people have to make in this era of living among technology. So this is a character who's like meant to be kind of a young person, and basically he's like a cyborg. He has all these parts that sustain him in a really harsh environment. And I think I was kind of feeling sympathetic to a generation of people who has to grow up as cyborgs, basically, and really kind of integrated with technology. And Hit Woman, who was sort of a representation of like violent revenge for the theft of one's own life and the kind of freedom and agency that was robbed of them. And it was like a very personal violence. And then I added two more characters after I left being a student. So these were less emotionally wrought, I think, in theming. So this is the Matador, who is just a character that invites violence as a performance. The botanist, who is a character who is like enacting violence on behalf of the planet. So she was like environmentalist, and she was like, putting people back into the earth because they were hurting it. So I think again, I wanted to make sure that all of these characters were representing very human violence and not inhuman violence. And I think it's important to think about games as a language trying to convey a part about ourselves. And I think what I learned from watching these things and being inspired by them is that we are violent creatures. We can't avoid that. We think about it kind of every single day. And I think aggressive behavior is human behavior. And violent games are a product of that, not the sword. It's a way for us to kind of exercise that feeling and feel catharsis in doing it. Without consequences, or without the context of politics and about actually hurting other people. So I think it's really good, right? It's actually serving a great service to our society, I believe. Maybe a hot take, but and I think the good news also is that we do this kind of thing all the time, not just with violence, but with other kinds of desires and kind of inner disgusting kind of instincts that we have, whether it's greed or lust, gluttony or pride. And I think games are the perfect medium to exercise these parts of us, right? where we don't have the objectivity to look at straight on in our daily lives, right? Because we think this is the kind of worst parts of us. But a game is the sort of a medium for which we can kind of look at that and exercise that and like really reflect internally with like, why am I playing this game all the time? What about the system is making me so like into it, right? And obsessed with it or addicted to it or something like that. It's a way for us to really understand ourselves. And I think embracing violence as a mechanic in gameplay, like making these kind of violent games, is a really good way to think about where we come from, just biologically, which is something that we can't undo or fix. Like we're gonna be who we've been for millennia. And I think what violence in games can say about ourselves, both as human beings that are, as we are, very intelligent, scheming, able to manipulate others for the purpose of our own gain, right? I think like being able to kind of critically look at that via a game is actually a good thing. And I think the question of what violence is doing in games deserves an answer that is not truistic and dismissive. I don't think it deserves measure by the amount of red on the screen. So we should really use it in sort of academic terms to talk about what games can do and should do for us, rather than whether it's causing harm to our psyche or something like that, or affecting change in the way that we are sensitized. I want to finish it off a little bit with some, I guess, basic kind of the guidelines that I kind of make games by, and I also tell my students to kind of make games by. I guess some like tips, I would say. And I think it's really helped me because, again, you can make a game about anything. So this question of like, what new thing are you trying to say via your game, right? About the humans that play them. Because I think each game is telling something about ourselves, but maybe you have like a new take, right? And I think this is a really difficult thing to decide on, because also games take a really long time to make. So it has like a long gestation period, and culture changes and the world changes while you're making them. But it's about kind of like adapting to that and reacting to that, right? The game is a form of reaction to wider culture. And this idea that like the games that kind of really move us and impact us and changes us and hurts us and are the ones that are breaking our innate idea of what humans are, right? And our like preconceptions and predilections, which are obstacles for making good art. I think the kind of the worst trait to have as a designer and artist is to be like, well, I believe a certain thing, and I'm going to really like kind of enact that upon my audience. I think love is important, so I'm going to make a game about love being important. I think the game that you make should challenge something about what you believe as well. To ultimately kind of think about games as a playable treatise of human nature, figure out kind of what about our nature is interesting and what makes us tick, and accept the kind of parts of us that we don't really look at straight on because it disturbs us or embarrasses us, something like that. And yeah, I think those are some good rules that have served me well, and I hope it serves you well as well. Thanks. That's my talk. I think I maybe went very long. It was almost an hour.
No, it's totally great. So we do have some time for questions, and so maybe if you have a question, you can put it into the chat, and we'll just kind of go down the list, and then we'll give a nice round of applause here at the very end. So Winnie, if you'd like to address any of these as they come in, please feel free. There's
Oh,
one here
sure.
from Cuttlefish Kitch. I'm not sure if you have the Twitch open or not. I can.
I don't, sorry.
What's that?
Why don't you ask me
Yeah,
via? Yeah.
you're good. So I'll read this one out here from Cuttlefish Kitch. Um, how accommodating to disabled students is the NYU Game Design Grad program? What programs, engine, and coding language does the Grad program utilize? What was the experience like going from being a student somewhere to teaching at the same place? So a couple of different questions there.
Yeah, I think really good questions. To talk about NYU Game Center's kind of sort of tools it uses, I think the way that we kind of view the engines that we use and the kind of programming languages we use they are tools, right? The thing that we want to avoid is our students becoming using them as kind of or getting too dependent on one, because as we know, engines are finite. Sometimes they are the ownership of those engines change frequently and more frequently than ever. And the kind of philosophy behind building those tools also change, right? So the thing that we try to avoid is to make sure there's no kind of doctrine about like, oh, Unity is the best engine or Unreal is the best engine, and we're going to only teach that, so you become dependent on that. So we try to be sort of agnostic in general. We do have like engine-specific studio classes where you can learn Unreal or you can Unity or Pico 8. We have a prototype studio based on that. But generally, I think it's going to depend on the professor's proficiency. I use Unity, so all of my classes that are digital development, I teach Unity and C#. But so it's a little bit of luck of the draw / what you want to learn. You can kind of go to these studio classes depending on like, oh, maybe I want to learn about Unreal Engine, and they will change. I think for sure, even next semester, some of the engines we'll be teaching and will change based on adjuncts, right, and based on full-time faculty interest. About what was it like going from a student to adjunct and full-time. It was definitely like a huge adjustment period, but at the time, I think I was already TAing a lot as a student and also giving kind of talks as a student to other students and things like that. So when I just came out of grad school and I was working on Bad Blood and other games, like freelance work, they just asked me if they wanted to teach a class. I was like, oh, sure, and I adjuncted. And then I left for good and explored a career. And then when I was invited to kind of come back, it felt really natural because Game Center felt like a home. It was like a place where I always found like-minded people to talk about games with, and I really missed that. And it was a great way for me to kind of work on games and also go back to academia, which is a place that I think I fit well in, and also it's the only place that that will have me, to be honest. So yeah, it was a kind of nice marriage. But again, I think it's about connections you make here, with faculty and also with the institution. Just remembering that it's an institution, I think, is really key. Yeah.
And in terms of the first part of the question, how accommodating is the grad program to students with disabilities?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's the question that I missed.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it is not as much as I think it could be. I think we talk about those topics a lot, about designing for certain sets of abilities that are different than the norm or whatever. For example, the visual lab class that I teach, we talk very deeply about not only tackling kind of visual disabilities and differences in a kind of physical sense, but also about difficulty, things like how much we can kind of mitigate or change about the interfacing, right? And kind of allowing for huge accessibility and a bigger audience than before. So games that are meant to be sort of hostile and really difficult, and thinking about how much is that worth if you're saying no to a bunch of people. But definitely, I think for particular kind of curriculum, maybe like classes or independent studies around that, there has been a little bit, but not much. And I think definitely, according to wider discourse, this is a topic that's actually very burgeoning and important and critical for the sustainable nature of our industry. So I think we should really work on that.
Great. So we've got another question here. environment storytelling versus text storytelling, which has a greater impact psychologically?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a big question. There's been a lot of like I think critical ridicule around environmental storytelling in games. Maybe you felt it too, Sam, but like this idea of like writings on the wall, like blood writings on the walls, and like skull next to the toilet or whatever. I mean, they're fair criticism, but I am driven by environmental storytelling more because the whole idea is that it's giving off a vibe that it's on me to translate for myself, as opposed to narrative, very it's just flat out messaging. There's no subtlety around it. There's no movement around it. It's like, well, this is just how I feel as a character, and I gotta feel it. So when I hear like my playable character feeling a certain way, or like an NPC telling me how I should feel, or there's like a narrator telling me how I should feel, because I'm like not a good student in that way. I don't want to really be told how to feel. So I lean more towards environmental storytelling, where it's like, well, here's some suggestions for how to feel, but it's still up to me, right? So in that way, I think it hits different people, right? Some people, they come to games because they want to be told how to feel. Maybe they have a lot of emotions outside, and they're like, I just want to basically play something to feel something very specific. But I personally lean more towards environmental storytelling, as long as it's done well and with thought.
Yeah. Okay, so here's one related to your teaching practice. Is there anything you wish you knew before becoming a game design teacher?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, because I think I adjuncted before when I just got out of school. I do remember feeling like I wish I knew that experience in the industry is not translatable. So the thing that I always tell students that I advise or teach is that my experience in the industry is never going to be one-to-one to your experience in the industry. Not because times have changed, because they have, but also because, there are so many moving parts to, again, inform your values and also what you're willing to take in the industry and what you're willing to do. And I think at the time as an adjunct, I never disclaimed that. So my advice always came off as like, oh, you should do this or you should do that. Which I don't think it ended up in like big problems or anything, but now I know, I think, to tell students that like, it's a very different industry now. It's a very different market, right? And the thing is, it's always changing. So what you think is gonna do well in the market, or like, in a storefront or something at this point, is going to change by the time that you ship, for example. So the thing that we gotta be agile about is that idea of like what we're interested in. The thing that we can't be agile about, and we should use as an anchor, is who we are, what interests us, and what drives us to make games. And I think letting students know that that's the thing that I got to, that kind of gut feeling, is something new that I've added to advising, for sure.
Yeah, and it's part of that tension you were describing between stability and freedom, right? So like,
Yes.
you go from this space where you have freedom and a space where you can explore these ideas without judgment and without, with a lot of space to make mistakes, and then this idea of going to a place that doesn't necessarily allow for that because it's not really the focus of the particular business. I think this is definitely connecting with this. Now, I have one other thing that I know that was related to your talk. You had a lot of really great things to say about the way that games have this way of apologizing for like their violent nature, where other kinds of media, like historically, do not, right? They're just like media, like there's just violence. And so there's a question here. Have you found that as you grow older, more comfortable, you ever lose violence as a kind of motivating force, or has your relationship with it changed? If you lost it in any way, how did you get it back?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there were times I was shaky about it, because I would give these talks about how necessary violence is in games, and people would come up being like, well, what about this kind of violence? What about this kind of violence? And yeah, I think it is a gray area in general, for sure. But I think the thing about the apology is the thing that I am always sure about, is the fact that like, well, if we are gonna put violence in games, we shouldn't feel sorry about it. We shouldn't package it in any way. We shouldn't dull it, because what we're trying to actually do is make people sensitized to it, and then realize how it moves us in that way and like kind of traumatizes us. yeah, but as for whether, again, like I've lost that connect, I think when you talk about me aging and becoming comfortable, I think the more I age, the less I know about the world, right? And that's just a fact of everyone, is because we're learning more context. The thing that we really believed in initially when we were young is actually broadened and is actually kind of gray and muddy and foggy. So I don't think you'll ever become comfortable with an idea, right, that you have, or a predilection that you have. It's always going to be more challenged. And I think, yeah, I think I do feel, especially I think playing or watching media that's overly violent has become a little bit of an issue where I'm like, I don't want to see this. I just want to have like a nice time when I'm watching a TV show. Much more than when I was younger, where I was like fine with slasher flicks and things like that. But I think my conviction that violence has a place in games and we should use it as a mechanic more thoughtfully and more intentionally hasn't changed, because the industry hasn't changed in that way. I think the industry still has a sort of apology and sort of kind of tepidness towards that idea, because they don't want to get yelled at by the audiences, right? No one wants to be yelled at in this industry. No one wants to be told that the thing that they're making is immoral. But I think the immorality, again, is coming from being unwilling to stand by that decision, to be like, well, we're making this a violent game because we want to say something about you guys as players, that you like this. And that change hasn't happened, I think, in the discourse. I think we're still talking about like whether this is going to impact our players in a bad way, and why can't we grow out of this? Like, why are we so image poor? And it's a terrible dialogue that I don't think games deserve. And hopefully, the dialogue changes.
Good. So maybe we still have time for a few more if you still got the energy.
Of course, yeah.
Perfect. So here's a question from the perspective, I imagine, of somebody here thinking about potentially immigrating to Canada to work in the games industry.
Yeah.
So they want to ask, maybe you've had coworkers who immigrated to Canada. Is it tough to be non-domestic over there?
It's tough right now because of COVID reasons. So, but I do want to say that I think with the kind of great leverage that COVID gave us, which is the realization that everyone should have known already, is the fact that game development is possible remote, right? So I think as long as you can kind of work remotely in studios that are set in the reason why I say it's great to work in games in Canada, because Canada, being a sort of socialist country and also just generally interested in games as an art form, and has always kind of been, they really support it, and they really give a lot of lenience in terms of like taxation of those kind of studios. So those studios are just more sustainable in terms of economic leeway, I would say. So which allows them to be more creative, and it allows them to make huge kind of scary decisions in terms of design without a lot of danger, as it were. So I think definitely like working internationally with some of the studios in Canada is possible. In terms of immigration, I think it is quite difficult. I think you have to like have lived there for longer than like 2 to 4 years or something. It's not impossible, and it's really, really welcoming in terms of definitely US to Canada immigration. And I definitely have some issues and political policies around like migrants and things like that, but it's not as bad as here. So, you can only go up from here, I would say. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
Great. So here's another sort of professional development oriented question specific to your practice. How was the transition from graphic design to game design, and how did it affect how you approached the actual design of your games?
Oh, I think the kind of the strengths that visual designers have, coming into the games industry, that games are, even analog games, are so dependent on the visual handle, right? That's like 99% of what players are looking at and they're working with and handling. So some proficiency in the kind of psychology around that, and structuring of like good compositions and good readable typography in game materials and things like that is a huge, I think, boon coming into the industry. As for graphic design, I think there's definitely similarities, because you're you're thinking already kind of audience centrically kind of thing, where it's like, this has to be work, this has to work, this design, and it has to work away from me. Like I can't always be there. And nature of graphic design is like you're making a piece of visual object that has to function well and work well away from you where you can't explain it. So I think that was a really nice transition. But I think just visual designers in general have a lot of initial strength coming into the industry. I know there's a little bit of like a class discussion around like visual designers in games and technical designers and whatever game designers and things like that. I don't think that if that exists, I think the hierarchy is actually visual designers are pretty high because again, we control a big part of what players are looking at. And there's a lot of big design decisions and thinking that comes with that power, I would say.
I think there's a tie-in question here, which is somebody who's describing that they're a graduating illustration major and they're kind of coming to game making a little bit later in their practice. And what would you recommend somebody do to get better at their game design, game making practice without necessarily getting a degree?
Oh, fair. Yeah, I think I would do a bunch of the thing that I think really tipped me over into being able to make a game on my own was taking this kind of like prototype class where you just have to make a prototype every week. So kind of structuring your learning timeline and schedule to be a bit more short, to be like, I'm gonna like try to make a game that's like a week, that takes me a week or like 2 days or something. Maybe not necessarily jams because those are, I think, inundated with ideas of like social and political relationships. So I would try like making stuff on your own in short term. I think that really helped me because I think visual designers are also kind of perfectionists because we don't really want to show stuff without it being done. I think that really hindered me initially when I was becoming a game designer because I was like, this is not ready, this is not ready. But this act of like making kind of terrible small things a lot really graduates you from that feeling. And especially in illustration, I know for a fact, all of my mother's an illustrator and it's all about the final product, not about the process. And the games are just about the process, unfortunately. And it's just about you kicking your own ass a little bit, you knowing yourself and how you work. And the end product isn't the end all, right? It's also about creating a practice and adopting one that works well for you and is sustainable. So I think you're gonna have to change how you work a little bit, as opposed to how you work in illustration, because games take time, and not only take time, but also take iteration, as opposed to illustration where it's like, well, here's a draft of it. And then overnight, depending on how late you left it, you're just gonna finish it, right? Yeah, those are my suggestions.
So maybe a couple of final questions here. These are both connected to the development of Bad Blood. So the first question is, did you have a team or were you completely independent when you were working?
Totally independent. I had a score artist, so a musician, who did the 2 scoring for the game, which was the menu song, Pierre Benam, and the in-game song. But everything else I did alone.
And how long did it take you to develop the game?
So the whole of thesis years was a year, and then it took me another year. I guess not another year actually, like half a year. So it was like a year and a half to make it.
And then the other question here related to this. So how do you react to the criticism or questioning towards Bad Blood for its gore, violence, brutality? Did it make you reevaluate how you design for audiences? Did it make you double down on embracing violence, or did it really have no effect at all?
It really didn't have. I think the kind of criticism that I did get, which was at the fighting game competition at EVO, which was like, I never really thought about this game as a get good game. Like I think I wanted it to be sort of a slow, kind of like fun experience that you could have with a friend. And then I think introducing it to a really competitive audience, where they were like really trying to create little tactics and strats to get really good and destroy the other person. I think that changed my design thinking in a big way, where I was like, I do want to make a competitive game, which means I had to do a lot of like technical redesigning to ensure that high level play wasn't filled with bugs and stuff. And also I introduced things like abilities that you can kind of use once in the game and depending on when you use it and where you use it, it can be a really good use or a waste. But as for reactions to the gore and the violence, I had it in the beginning and all throughout development, but they were never like negatively criticized. They were just wondering. People were just being like, why are we killing each other? Why can't we just like catch each other like hide and seek? And I think I just reacted to that as like, oh, I'm gonna make this my thesis statement, you know. And I think it's fair. Any kind of criticism you get, there should be a processing. You should never just consume it. You should never just be like, oh, they don't like that, you know. What should I do about that? If a player doesn't like it, you should figure out where that stems from and wonder, maybe it's not intentional enough. Maybe you're apologizing too much, right? And at that point, maybe I was apologizing too much. Maybe I just had like a little bit of a bloody effect, and it wasn't clear enough that I wanted it to be super bloody. And that's why people were wondering and asking me. But by the end, definitely people stopped asking me. People stopped being like, oh, what, is this a violent game? Because it was clearly a violent game. So yeah, if you're having questions about why your game is a certain way, I think the double down is not the right term, but I think it's just like, I would make it very clear. I would just be like, hey, I'm gonna make it very clear that that is what I'm intending. Yeah.
And I know one thing that you were mentioning when you were telling us a little bit about the development, you were talking about the slowness of that game, especially in terms of it being like a fighting game. It's a very slow game. It's not about sort of like quick, fast, intense violence. It's about like it's a one hit kill. There was a question here, which was just, you know, when it comes to horror in games, what is your stance on suspense versus dread? It seems like you might have a feeling on one versus the other.
Yeah, I guess the difference between suspense versus dread is that dread is like, it's inevitable that you're gonna die, right? And it's just about when. But suspense, I think, is just like the feeling of that like waiting for it to happen is the horror, right? And I think I'm more angling towards suspense in this game because the difference between you winning and the other player winning is very slim. So it's not like, I don't know, like a shooter in which if you have better aim, this could be a huge distance between you, right? And it's just a kind of game of chance at that point. But in this game, you have to be really close, which means that depending on who strikes first, it could be a game ender regardless. So I think that a big influence also was like games like Bushido Blade, which is another one-hit kill fighting game. Very slow, very kind of like a lot of, you know, slashing against each other, like trying to attack and not working. And I think again there is about keeping composure during that suspense, right? So like not just anticipating your own death, but trying to visualize the other person's death. So it requires kind of mind training in that way, so you don't get tilted or afraid to act. But I do think, like, I think in terms of in horror games genres, I'm more interested in dread, which is the idea of like, well, something is gonna happen, and it's all about when it's gonna happen and where I'm gonna be emotionally when that happens. Am I gonna be fine with it? Will I be through the grief stages, or am I still gonna be afraid? But yeah, great question.
Good. Well, we still have a couple of additional questions, but we really have taken a lot of your time, and so I know it's getting late. Is there a place that people can follow up with you to be able to, to get back in touch and maybe ask some questions either about, what you do in terms of your teaching up at the NYU Game Center, or in terms of other things related to their own professional practice?
Yeah, you can email me at wsong@nyu.edu. You can also reach out to me on Twitter. If you just search my name, I might be there. Or you can ask Sam to connect us on email if you don't want to remember that email. But again, thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks for having me, Sam. This was really fun, and it was really fun to kind of reminisce as to like what formed this design position. So I'm glad that you remembered this game. I'm really flattered.
Yeah, it's still a fantastic game. We put it out here. It was the first time I'd played it in a number of years, but it still has this really kind of magical, disorienting quality to it, and that feeling that you were just describing of dread. The whole thing it's like you're waiting to die. You've got your
Yeah.
5 chances here, and you're basically waiting for your turn to die. And it's still really just a really wonderful game. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and again, being so generous with your time and answering these questions. Let's give Winnie a big round of applause virtually here.
Thanks again.
And thank you all again for joining us tonight. Take care. Be safe.